Hi everyone, and welcome to Sustainable Edge, a podcast produced by Position Green. I'm Joachim Nahem, Executive Chairman at Position Green and your host for this podcast. In this episode, we speak about why does climate risk matter for businesses, how to set credible net zero goals, sustainability regulation, is it a glass half full or half empty, carbon offsets and credits, legitimate way to net zero, or opening Pandora's box. The importance of human agency, why we have more power than you perhaps realize. Welcome back to Sustainable Edge. We're live from London today. I'm very pleased to have with me David Carlin, who is an acknowledged authority on climate change and its implications for the financial system. David is the founder of Cambium Global Solutions, which is an advisor to governments, corporates, and financial institutions on climate and ESG topics. David is also the head of Climate Risk and TCFD for the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, UNEP FI, and over the past years, he's worked with more than 100 global banks, investors, insurers on climate scenarios, climate risk assessments, and climate governance. David, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So I would like to ask you to explain climate risk as though you were speaking with a family member or a friend you haven't seen for a long time who is not in this world of sustainability or finance or all of these things. How would you explain it?
Yeah, well, provided that family member would still be willing to talk to me after I launched into a discussion of climate risk, I would start with the fact that the impacts of climate change are a lot broader than we think they are. Very often when you ask people about climate change, you hear, well, temperatures are warmer, sea levels are rising. But what we're really talking about is an energy balance problem. We're adding energy into the system, the environmental, the natural world. It is causing changes in behaviors, whether it's the range of dangerous pests. We've seen mosquito-borne diseases spreading more widely in Europe. We've seen Lyme disease spreading into northern US states and into Canada. It's about water and water availability as areas become more desertified, as freshwater availability decreases due to decreases in meltwater from ice. So it's really getting a sense of the diversity of impacts, but also on the other side of that coin, the world that we need to create is going to look quite different than the world of today, which means that many organizations today that are doing things that are status quo are going to have to change. And so when I think about climate risks, what I really try to give people is a twofold view. One, the diversity of physical risks and how they can not only work in the direct sense, but create these chains and cascades of, well, what happens when transportation systems are down? How does that affect economic activity? How does that then affect tax revenues? We start to put these pieces together because they don't exist in isolation. And then similarly on the transition side, different elements, if we're going to change policies to make energy more low carbon, what is that going to do to affordability? How are we going to think about that affordability when, sure, it's great to have wind and solar, but what if we don't have the ability to provide people that are looking for mass transit the transit links that they need because we haven't built that? We've only thought about EVs. And so realizing the diversity of these changes to me is kind of how I try to get people to think about climate risk, because with a little bit of that thought, you realize both the expansiveness of the challenge, but also the degree of transformation that it will and must bring.
And so one of the things I imagine you spend a lot of time on is working with governments, private sector, different organizations on trying to imagine how climate change impacts or manifests itself. And you mentioned it's quite multifaceted. And one of the ways of doing this is looking at different scenarios based on climate change. At the same time, it's, as you said, so complex. Can you give any examples of where it's developed in a way that you actually didn't see happening? We're hearing all the time on climate risk, on physical climate risk, new phenomena or new examples in different parts of the world where maybe we hadn't imagined it. Anything that sort of caught you off guard, or that is sort of an example of things one could not predict?
Yeah, I mean, this is remarkably unsteady ground, both in the terms of scientific consensus. Tree planting is this great example where there have been a lot of justifiable reasons to stop deforestation. There's many good benefits that trees provide, but that then kind of got picked up into this trillion tree project and the idea that trees will solve climate change. I remember sitting through an oil major back in 2019 talking about their reforestation strategy as an offset. And, I think they were unaware that the overall offsets from their historical emissions would be reforesting an area about the size of Mexico. So then we saw studies saying, actually, well, trees don't necessarily hold carbon as well as we thought they did, because when they decompose, they actually release other gases. So maybe trees aren't the solution to climate change. And then more recently, there have been studies saying, well, actually, trees do provide some meaningful benefits in trapping carbon. And so you're literally talking about the efficacy of solution shifting. I think you're also talking about the fact that you have dynamics that are really nonlinear. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are stuck in a early 2010s headspace when it comes to we're either transitioning or we're not. We're either going to have renewable energy everywhere or nowhere. But that isn't the world we inhabit. 80% of new generation capacity globally was low carbon last year, which is remarkable. The parity between investment in low carbon and fossil fuels means that we are moving to a different place. But those are things that would not have been easy to see. Similarly, the retrenchment with the invasion of Ukraine in fossil fuels, this argument that we had for a number of years where ESG is simply better. Oil companies are money losers. Well, that argument hasn't looked so strong since 2022. There's a lot more complexity there. And so I think it's important to take that received wisdom and really continue to be both observational and scientific about it and say, the solutions are going to evolve. The knowledge that we have is going to evolve. And then just on the physical side, we've gotten so much more information, so much more specificity about how these effects happen. And unfortunately, the more we learn, the more I think we're concerned about the extent to which we are destabilizing systems that we were beginning to realize we don't fully understand.
But you mentioned Ukraine briefly and the energy production. And obviously that's one thing caught most people off guard, throwing this sort of geopolitical phenomenon into the mix, where we now also have oil producers, whether they are nations or corporates, saying that there is a geopolitical premium for them to continue producing. So I'm based in Oslo in Norway, as you know, and this has been a very strong argument used by the government and the oil producers in Norway, saying basically that this is a benefit for political stability. Europe is asking them to produce more gas. It is a geopolitically better way to do it. It is a less carbon intensive production than the alternative. So they're sort of throwing in new arguments on why to continue the production and thereby also exploration of oil and gas.
Yeah, I think the reality is that there are new reasons that fossil fuel use in the short term may prove more resilient than initially thought. But even when we look at 2050 scenarios, the net zero scenarios, we're still talking about fairly modest, but still meaningful petroleum usage, natural gas usage. That doesn't mean that those are areas to expand. And these areas do need to be thinking about what does the wind down mean to get there. But I think another misconception people tend to take is, oh, well, there'll be no oil in 2050. No. And at the same time, I think the other end of the spectrum is also wrong of, well, if it's still 70% of current demand, well, that shouldn't even be an issue. Well, I'll tell you, when about 5 to 10% of demand was curtailed during COVID, we saw prices go negative for futures because this is a physical commodity and there's literally not enough places to store it. So the dynamic between prices and demand is a particularly pronounced one. The other thing, though, I'll say is when it comes to geopolitical stability and these concerns, yeah, we do need to be adaptable, but we also need to make sure that we're not allowing that adaptability to become excuses for lock-in. I think one of the big things also that really was a theory that failed was this sort of, if we give more money to companies that need to transition, they will transition faster. Well, we've seen 2 years of windfall profits, and what we're seeing, if anything, is a doubling down on fossil fuel production, an idea that this is the near-term way to maximize gains. And so the argument that it is because these are capital-starved firms that they're not transitioning, I think we can kind of dispense with that.
How serious do you see the challenge of oil majors now either watering down or reneging on commitments? You mentioned 2050, which is a sort of common target for companies saying that they'll be net zero. And we've seen a huge number of companies commit to this over the past years, whether it's aligned with the Science-Based Target Initiative or not. And significantly, the oil majors, who obviously are one of the biggest emitters historically and at present, more or less signed up for this. A little bit difference between the European and US oil majors. But we're now seeing across the board that they are backtracking. How much of a setback do you think that is to the sort of overall net zero movement?
I think, and maybe it's a bit controversial to say, but I think it's less of a setback than we may think, in the sense that I think there was always a bit of naivete, both in those making commitments, but also those taking commitments at face value. I think that the fossil fuel industry is going to do what is in its near-term economic interest and what is going to be acceptable under both the political and social discourse of the time. And to believe anything else just because they say it, I think, is to fall for a bit of misdirection. And that's not to levy a moral judgment on that, but just to say we've seen multiple times, these have been some of the earliest companies in the development of solar, in the development of biofuels. And each time these things get to a size that is modest, they kind of get sheared off, whether it's, shuttering projects that Exxon is doing with using algae for fuels, whether it's BP selling off parts of its renewables business. These things are never seemingly going to be allowed to grow to a size where they really become a transition. And so dropping, making Total Energies, making BP beyond petroleum, these are fine as branding exercises, but I think taking them at face value, these are market actors that will do what the market is saying and what policymakers are requiring. So I think it's less of a step back. It is a little bit dispiriting to see how slippery that mask was, that it didn't take much to cause that backsliding. But I still think that there are other actors, whether it be in the form of governments, finance, civil society, that will be the decisive ones, because these are the ones that are the ones really permitting the operating space for the fossil fuel companies.
But if we accept that business is cyclical, not just for oil majors, but for others, and that in the short term, that will mean that they perhaps postpone or water down commitments, how can we avoid this? Meaning, how can we still come up with credible targets that give some flexibility, or have built in that business is cyclical and one can't always be too stringent, but that at the same time a commitment is a commitment? Because again, why should we believe any 2050 commitment if it so easily can be, if they're so malleable, essentially?
And I think that actually is a great connection into some work that I was fortunate to do with the UK's Transition Plan Task Force, and looking at the recommendations and guidance of that, because in a lot of ways, transition plans are kind of the main focus of, if you make a commitment, the commitment can be good, but the actual progress and likelihood of success is going to come down to the plan you have. A lot of these commitments to me are signing up to a marathon, but we're all arguing about how long the marathon is. There doesn't need to be much argument. We know it's an ambitious goal. We know what the goal is. But if you really want to see who's going to finish that marathon, start looking at the training plan. And that's where I really see a lot more evidence of commitments, because it's one thing for you to tell me you're going to do something. It's another for me to begin to see the evidence, whether it's through looking at your Strava or looking at what changes you've made. But I think that to me is more indicative than anything that is said. And there are some firms that maybe haven't made commitments but are positioning themselves. But I would say it's very hard to see for firms that are spending well less than 1% of their overall operational budgets on low carbon energy sources, how that shift really happens. It's just, to me, that there doesn't feel like there's a way there from here for many of them. And that's going to be, in many cases, to their detriment. Or you could argue that they have a view that there is a limited lifespan and they're going to, kind of a la fixed income, return a certain amount over this period of time. But they know that they're not indefinite. And that's an interesting thing to think about, because for the most part, most business operates as a going concern, operates with the idea that they're going to continue on. And maybe what we're seeing a little bit with fossil fuels is firms beginning to say, can we extract the maximum we're able to? Because we know the game will be up. And I don't know if that's a hopeful sign, because it certainly is a challenging thing to deal with, but it's certainly a shift from, we're going to try to transition because we want in 2100 for there to be an Exxon, we want for there to be one of these companies, or is it to say, hey, we know our days are numbered, so might as well make them good for us as they go. But I think those are the kinds of questions, and that's why transition plans are so important, because a plan isn't just what you put into it. A plan is the evidence that the thing you committed to is actionable for you. And I think you're going to see investors, supervisors, others beginning to ask those questions and look, are you planning on just running this down? It's not much of a transition plan. Or are you planning on really doing something? And I think if you don't see it in capital allocations within those plans, if you don't see it in a viable strategy, it is a bit of smoke and mirrors. You can say you're doing this and that, but if it's not being borne out, as I said, it's hard to see how you get there from here.
But isn't there a little bit of a dilemma if there seem to be sort of two extreme ways to go about it? One is just to, and we saw a lot of examples of this, just make a 2050 commitment and then figure out the rest later, perhaps, even all the way down to 2040. And it's not, for the boards and the C-suite who did that, basically it's not my problem. The next or the one following that will figure it out, but put the commitment out there, and it's a little bit of a symbolic gesture, versus the ones that are maybe very serious about this, or even risk averse and don't want to be held liable. So they will not make a commitment because they don't have all the plans, they don't have the capital allocation, they don't have the technology, they don't basically have a clear pathway to net zero. So they're avoiding making any kind of commitment to it. How do you strike a balance? Because obviously some of it is about, it's a horse and cart dilemma. What comes first here? Can you actually use the commitment then to leverage that and say we've committed, so now we have to come up with a plan, versus the ones who spend too much time on it or are not willing to take any kind of commitment?
All in all, a commitment is a good thing. It's a powerful thing. And part of the reason why is because I really take the theory that this is material financial information. If you're saying you are going to be a net zero firm, you're saying you're going to reach that point. I, as an investor, am able to use that as useful information. I agree with that. In the same way you might say, oh, we're going to pivot to Asia, or oh, we're going to introduce a new product, or oh, we're going to rebalance what we're doing so our initial revenue stream isn't so dependent on this or that. Those are decisions. And so if you announce them and you have no intention of following through or no credible way to do so, I think you really very quickly run into some significant issues, especially for public companies. Private companies, perhaps it's a little bit more gray because it may not be in financial statements, but making these kind of public statements certainly, to me, has the force and effect, and I think should be treated as such. I would say, though, that all in all,
well, at the same time, in the private market now, we have asset owners who are publicly traded, and if you look at all the trillions of dollars under management in the private market, somebody owns that, and you can kind of hold them accountable.
And I think that commitments, perhaps one of the reasons for the kind of fewer commitments more recently is an appreciation of the challenge that this is, a little bit of this green hushing of, well, we don't want to get in trouble, a little bit of the political blowback in the US and in other places. But I really think that there's a degree to which you can create momentum through commitments. You can mainstream this. The fact that almost every major mainstream financial institution has some commitment does matter. So the challenge to me is that the commitment is necessary but not sufficient. To use the marathon analogy, you can't win the race if you're not entering. But on the other hand, simply entering a marathon doesn't make you fit, doesn't make you able to complete it. And I think that it's not only better to have the commitments, it doesn't also just sit alone, but also inspires and pressures others to do so. But I think that it is a step that, if it stands alone, does eventually get cheapened, and in many cases, as I said, can be misleading from an investment standpoint.
And, we speak a lot about EU regulators, US. What about the rest of the world? And you obviously do the work through the UN, speaking about more of a global governance approach. But what about regulators outside of the OECD? We're here in the UK, but also China, Singapore. What are they doing specifically on climate risk or climate?
So there's a number of really interesting and important developments. Across Africa, you have a wide number of supervisors that are making requirements on disclosure. You have physical risk stress tests that the South African Reserve Bank is doing. You have guidance coming out of India.
And we hear very little about this, even though, at present, given the population, the size of the economy in India, or by 2050, I believe, half of the world's population is going to be in Africa. We don't really hear much about this.
No, and I think in some ways that's a little bit of a failure of our orientation from a media standpoint, from a news standpoint, because a lot of these things are aspiring to learn. I think right now the Network for Greening the Financial System, that collective of supervisors and central banks, is at 138 members. Of course, that means the majority of them are going to be from non-OECD countries. And so as a result of that, you are seeing this progress. Many of those countries are in a slightly earlier state of implementation, but I think it would be unfair to really underplay the amount of both interest and focus, especially in countries that are going to be subject both to the demands of increasing development on their potential emissions profile, but also, of course, the ravages of physical risk. And a good example of that is in Vietnam, and I've done some work with the state bank there, looking at the fact that energy demand is going to grow by something like 3 to 5 times, depending on the projections, over the next 2 decades. And so how are you going to provide that without burning more coal, without creating more emissions? And yet at the same time, if any country needs headroom, it's going to be countries like Vietnam that are looking to improve the overall well-being of their people. And so how do you kind of walk that line of, we can't say no? And I was speaking to friends who are involved in many of the multilateral development banks about how do you decide about greenlighting or not greenlighting projects in places where development and environmental concerns don't go together. In many cases they do, and I think we create this false dichotomy that it's one or the other. But I do think that these kinds of things don't get enough play and enough discussion, and we sometimes have this self-satisfaction in Europe, in the UK, in North America, that we're going to solve it. And what we really mean is, this is a hard challenge for us. And if we get there, but it's going to be cold comfort to find out that if Europe gets to net zero, 92% of the world's emissions are still going to be there. Of course, we hope they would also decrease as well. But it means that these countries need to play an outsized role in terms of moving finance, in terms of moving capabilities. But simply just getting your own house in order is not going to be sufficient. And unfortunately, so many of these conversations that I'm part of are ones that are very much, what are we doing here? And of course, that's why that's prioritized. But to me, the game of climate's going to be won and lost in the emerging markets.
On this podcast, we usually ask guests about their personal journey. Why did you end up working in this space? Or how do you practice this in your private life? What does sustainability mean to you? What's your story?
So sustainability to me really is about being able to continue doing the things that you've been doing, and things that don't fit that bill, whether it is using more of the earth than is able to regenerate, are really that definition of unsustainable. And so to me, I think we often kind of have that narrow definition. Sustainability is about green, but it's really about keeping this human game going and improving and keeping human flourishing, as I would say, but also restoring a natural world. We can't have an economy without a planet. We can't have any of these things. And so when I think of my personal journey, to me, it's been one of really growing from somebody who worked much more on the quantitative side, the analytical side, within the financial sector, to this awareness. I think one of the aha moments for me when I moved from management consulting into advising the UN was we can't really make decisions or evaluations on a one-for-one basis. When we were younger, we maybe learned about the food pyramid, but now we actually call it the food web. And the reason is that these webs and this ecosystem connections we can't just pull one thing out and assume that we can properly evaluate it. We need to think about where it fits into context. And that's as true in a forest or in the ocean as it is in politics, as it is in economics. And so to me, that was one of the big sea changes in how I think. And, in my day-to-day life, I try to be more conscious. I probably travel more than the average person. But I think what I always tell people is not to feel guilty, but really to try to be mindful and to say, what can you do? And in some cases, the what can you do can be a lot more impactful on things that you didn't think about than on things that you did. So very often people will tell me, I only buy local, or I always recycle. And those things are good, but one thing on recycling is, if you remember from when we were kids, the 3 green arrows, it's reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycle is the bottom of that list. If you can reduce your consumption, if you can reuse things you already have, all of those are better than recycling. It's not to say recycling doesn't matter. I don't like the argument that it does nothing, but it's not going to change things. Things downcycle, they don't really upcycle. And so other things that can make a bigger difference, everyone loves talking about local food. 90+% of a food's footprint comes from its growth and production, not from its transportation. So feel free eating bananas from South America, but if you're going to eat less meat, you're going to have a bigger impact. And similarly with flying, if you can take a train, if you can use mass transit versus a petroleum vehicle, these things for the average person do tend to add up. But I think the last one is raise your voice. It's amazing how quiet voices are. And because these places are so quiet, call if you have a pension plan. Call if you are working at a big company to know what their policy is. You'll be amazed how few people call up. I remember when I was at a consultancy, I got about 5 of my friends to call up our parent company about the 401k. They said, nobody's really asked about a fossil fuel-free option. But we got a few calls about that yesterday. And so you realize that even in a massive organization, you can actually be the spark of organizational change. And in that case, you may do even more than flying less or eating less meat.
So we do have agency at the end of the day.
I think a lot more than we often use.
David Carlin, it's been a pleasure having you on Sustainable Edge. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Up until 2023, businesses were gung-ho about signing up to net zero initiatives, most notably the Science Based Target Initiative, which quadrupled its number of signatories to 4,000 companies. Likewise, investors were committing to net zero initiatives across the board. The Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative has more than $37 trillion under management. Fast forward to 2024, and companies and investors are no longer in a rush to join net zero initiatives. And in some cases, businesses and investors are actually backtracking or reneging on their net zero commitments. Not all of this backtracking is necessarily a bad thing. Companies and investors are rightfully afraid of being called out on greenwashing, whether by climate activists or regulators. However, we have to remember that net zero will remain equal parts art and science, and companies should not shy away from setting long-term goals. We need companies to remain ambitious and not let perfection be the enemy of good. Unless we give substance to net zero targets, I'm afraid we will continue to be reminded by Greta Thunberg's quote as follows: "Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah." This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words that sound great, but so far have led to no action. Our hopes and ambitions drown in their empty promises.